So thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. I'm sorry, I'm not going to speak in Spanish. I would next time, promise. But today I'm going to do it in English. Sorry. It's a pity, in fact, to speak English with people from Latin America, but let's go. So, tendon transfer, nowhere. What I've learned from my failure. I think this is the most important. Let's look at this case. A man, 55 years old, manual worker, pain, 5 out of 10. Look at the video here. The forward flexion is around 80 degrees. But the passive range of motion is normal, painful, but normal. This is very important. Most of the time, the pseudoparetic shoulder are stiff shoulder. When you have a good passive range of motion, most of the time you have good range of motion. As you can see here, the subscap is good. And you have a lag sign, more than 50 degrees, which means that we publish that, which means that the teres minor is torn. Look at the X-ray. The subscap is good. You have no supra, no infra, no teres minor. For this patient, I decided to perform a lat dorsal transfer. I wanted to do that for him in order to restore range of motion. And the results was poor. I had a bad result for this patient. I was very upset, very unsatisfied. So I said, why? Why is it a bad result? Because the subscap was not torn, and it has been published that if you want a good result for your lat dorsal transfer, you need to have a good subscap. Here, the subscap was good. Perhaps it was related to the fact that it was a pseudoparetic shoulder. In fact, it is true. In case of pseudoparetic shoulder, the results of lat dorsal transfer are not very good or even bad. Perhaps it was due to something else. So I've looked at the literature and I found in this systematic review that in case of teres minor atrophy, when the teres minor is involved, the results of the lat dorsal transfer are not very good. So I looked at the paper from Christian Gerber, who is the godfather for tendon transfer, and I was surprised to see, in fact, if you look at the table into the patient, you can see that when the teres minor is involved, the result of the lat dorsal transfer are not so good. So conclusion number one, lat dorsal transfer does not restore motion in case of pseudoparetic shoulder. And be aware of the quality of the teres minor. If you have a bad teres minor, most of the time you have it's not so easy to have a good result of your lat dorsal transfer. But I was very anxious about that because I said it's strange because I see a lot of patients in my practice. They can elevate your arm and they have a massive rotator cuff tear. So it was strange for me to see that sometimes the patients were able to elevate their arm, and sometimes they are not able to elevate their arm. So we decided to make a study with Gilles Valch, and we've published it in the JSES in 2014. What have we done? We've separated the cuff in 5 compartments: teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and we divided the subscapularis into 2 compartments: the superior subscapularis and the inferior subscapularis. And we did a classification, as you know it perhaps now, with type A, B, C, D, and E. It means that in type A you have only 2 tendons involved, in the type C, D you have only 2 tendons involved, and in type B, C, and E you have 3 tendons involved. Let's look at the result for the forward elevation. You can see that when you have only supra and superior part of the subscap which are involved, most of the time you have a good forward flexion. When you have no supra, no subscap at all, the forward flexion is poor. When it's an antero-posterior lesion, it's 50-50. It's not so good, but sometimes you can restore some range of motion. What was very, very interesting, this is the point, in fact, the fact that in type D, when you have a good subscap, a good teres minor, most of the time you have a good forward elevation. In type E, no supra, no infra, no teres minor, you have only the subscap. You can see that the forward flexion is not so bad. But look now at the rate of pseudoparietic shoulder. Very interesting to see that when you have no supra, no subscap, you have a high risk to have a pseudoparietic shoulder. But when you have a good subscap and good teres minor, the rate of pseudoparietic shoulder is very low, almost never. So let's look at this case. This is a woman, 57 years old, and housekeeper, and the pain is 3 out of 10. You can see here, we could say it's a pseudoparietic shoulder. And you can see here, there is no supra, no infra, the subscap is good, the teres minor is good. So which transfer for her I did? Look at this. Believe me, if you do a lat dorsal transfer for this patient, it works like that. If you do a lower trapezoid transfer, it works like that. But what I have done for this patient, I've done only rehabilitation for her, and we have had this result only with rehabilitation. And we've published our results. We published our result, as you can see here, that if you have only the lat dorsal transfer, then if you have a good teres minor, only rehabilitation can work. So take home message number 1. In type D, latissimus dorsi transfer or trapezius transfer work very well because you have a good teres minor. But you have a lot of other options. You can make rehabilitation, partial repair, and the results are the same. The problem is the type E. The problem in the type E is when you have no teres minor, it's really more difficult. And if you look at the result of the latissimus dorsi transfer for type E, as it has been reported by Pascal Boileau, if you look at the paper, you have 30% of failure of lat dorsi transfer when you have no teres minor. So, in other words, what does it mean? It means that the lat dorsi transfer works very well, but you don't need of it in the type D. But when you really need of it in the type E, then you have a failure in 30% of the case. And recently, we've published the results we've compared with Jean Cany the result of lat dorsi transfer and the result of partial repair, and we are surprised to see that the result of the partial repair was better than the tendon transfer for the type E patient. Now it's new. You have another option, which is to perform a lower trapezius transfer. I don't do that personally, but it seems that the results are better. But I think that we need more follow-up. So take home message number 2. When you have no teres minor, the lat dorsi transfer doesn't work very well. Perhaps it's a good indication for lower transfer. I don't know yet. I need more follow-up. Now, let's go with the massive anterior tear, means type B, as you can see here. In this kind of patient, we've tried to rehabilitate them, and the result of the rehabilitation was very, very poor. It's always a failure when you have a bad cuff like this. You cannot try the rehabilitation. It does not work, as you can see here. This is a case of a patient.
Allez-y, levez jusqu'au maximum. Encore.
C'est tout. Good.
Et vous redescendez. D'accord. Allez-y, tenez, comme ça, vous allez essayer de tenir. Comme ça. Et vous allez essayer de relever votre main vers le haut. Ne l'avez pas plus haut.
Non, non.
Par contre, c'est moi qui vais. Allez-y, devant vous. Et vous redescendez. Et dernière chose, vous mettez votre... Vous allez essayer.
You can see on the results that there is no supra, no subscap. Some people would suggest a pectoralis major transfer, but you can look at the literature and you can see that in this publication, the result, the increasing of the forward flexion only from 24 degrees to 60 degrees. So it's a very, very poor result. And it does not work in case of pseudoparetic shoulder. It has been published. And furthermore, I think that it's like the teres minor. When you have a good supra, you can perform a pec major transfer, but you don't need of it. But you have no supra, no subscap, pectoralis major transfer does not work. And sometimes it can be dangerous. You can have lesion of the brachial plexus. So be careful of that. For me, when you have a pseudoparetic shoulder with no supra, no subscap, the only option is reverse shoulder arthroplasty. Thank you so much, and thank you again for the invitation. It will be a pleasure to come in South America next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.